The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine grounds of Buckingham Palace, as Sergeant Marcus Thompson adjusted his red tunic and checked his ceremonial sword one final time. 23 years of dedicated service to the crown had earned him the respect of his fellow guards and the trust of the royal family. His record was spotless, his dedication unwavering, and his loyalty absolute. Marcus had joined the Coldstream Guards fresh out of military training, drawn by the honor and tradition that came with protecting the monarchy. Over the years, he had witnessed countless state occasions, met foreign dignitaries, and stood guard during some of the most significant moments in recent British history. His colleagues often joked that he bled red, white, and blue. Such was his devotion to duty. The palace corridors buzzed with their usual morning activity as staff prepared for another day of royal engagements. Marcus made his rounds, checking security protocols and ensuring his team was ready for the day ahead. King Charles was scheduled to meet with several foreign ambassadors, followed by a garden party for distinguished guests. It was the kind of day that required absolute precision and attention to detail. As Marcus walked through the East Gallery, he noticed something unusual. A maintenance worker he didn't recognize was working near one of the palace's most sensitive areas. The man was tall, wore the standard palace maintenance uniform, but something about his behavior seemed off. He kept glancing around nervously and appeared to be taking longer than necessary with his task. Marcus approached the man with professional courtesy. Palace protocol required all maintenance staff to be escorted and to display proper identification at all times. When Marcus asked to see the worker's credentials, the man became visibly agitated. He fumbled through his pockets, claiming he had left his badge in his van outside. The explanation didn't sit right with Marcus. His years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and every fiber of his being was telling him something was wrong. He politely but firmly asked the man to accompany him to verify his identity with the security office. The maintenance worker's response was immediate and alarming. Without warning, the man reached into his toolbox and pulled out what appeared to be a small explosive device. Marcus's training kicked in instantly. Time seemed to slow as he assessed the threat and calculated his options. The man was positioned dangerously close to the route King Charles would take to reach his morning appointments. In that split second, Marcus made a decision that would change his life forever. He lunged forward, tackling the would-be attacker before he could activate the device. The two men crashed to the marble floor, grappling desperately as the explosive device skittered across the polished surface. Marcus managed to pin the intruder down while shouting for backup. Palace security responded within seconds, swarming the area and securing both the suspect and the device. The bomb squad was called immediately, confirming that the device was indeed live and could have caused significant damage and loss of life. The investigation that followed revealed the shocking truth. The attacker was part of a radical group that had been planning to target King Charles for months. They had managed to infiltrate the palace's maintenance contractor, providing their operative with legitimate access to the building. The plan was to detonate the device during the king's morning walk through the East Gallery, a route he took almost daily. Marcus's quick thinking and brave actions had prevented what could have been a catastrophic attack on the monarchy. The security footage showed clearly how his intervention had saved not only the king's life but potentially the lives of several staff members who would have been in the vicinity. News of the incident spread quickly through the palace. Staff members who had worked alongside Marcus for years were not surprised by his heroic actions. To them, it was simply Marcus being Marcus, putting duty and the safety of others before his own well-being. The initial response from palace officials was overwhelmingly positive. Marcus was commended for his vigilance and bravery. His immediate superiors praised his quick thinking and professional response to an unprecedented situation. It seemed clear that Marcus would be recognized appropriately for his life-saving actions. However, as the investigation continued, complications began to emerge. Questions were raised about how the security breach had occurred in the first place. Palace officials were under intense pressure to explain how an armed intruder had managed to penetrate one of the most secure buildings in the world. Media attention intensified when details of the incident were leaked to the press. Headlines screamed about security failures and lapses in protection protocols. The palace found itself in the uncomfortable position of having to defend its security measures while simultaneously praising the guard who had prevented disaster. Marcus continued his duties as normal, believing that the recognition he deserved would come in due time. He had done what any dedicated guard would do: protect the royal family at all costs. The thought that his actions might somehow be viewed negatively never crossed his mind. Behind closed doors, however, discussions were taking place that would soon turn Marcus's moment of heroism into a bureaucratic nightmare. Palace administrators, worried about public perception and potential criticism of security protocols, began looking for ways to minimize the incident's impact on the institution's reputation. Some officials argued that highlighting Marcus's heroism would only draw more attention to the security breach itself. They worried that too much focus on the guard's actions would lead to uncomfortable questions about how the situation had been allowed to develop in the first place. As days passed, Marcus noticed a subtle shift in how he was being treated. Conversations seemed to stop when he entered rooms. His superiors became less communicative about the ongoing investigation. The promised recognition for his bravery seemed to be indefinitely delayed. What Marcus didn't know was that a decision was being made that would shock him to his core. Instead of being celebrated as a hero, he was about to become a scapegoat for a system that had failed. The very institution he had risked his life to protect was preparing to turn its back on him in the most devastating way possible. 3 weeks after the incident that had made him a hero, Marcus Thompson received a summons that would shatter his world. He was called to report to the office of Colonel Harrison, the commanding officer of the Palace Guard. Marcus assumed it was finally time for his official commendation and perhaps a promotion in recognition of his brave actions. The walk to Colonel Harrison's office felt different that morning. Staff members who usually greeted Marcus warmly seemed to avoid eye contact. His fellow guards appeared uncomfortable around him, as if they knew something he didn't. The atmosphere in the palace had grown cold and unwelcoming. Colonel Harrison's office was a study in military tradition, with photographs of past commanders lining the walls and medals displayed in glass cases. The colonel sat behind his mahogany desk, his expression stern and unreadable. 2 other officials Marcus didn't recognize flanked him, their suits suggesting they were from the palace's administrative hierarchy rather than military personnel. Marcus stood at attention, expecting to hear words of praise and gratitude. Instead, Colonel Harrison cleared his throat and began reading from a prepared statement. The words that followed hit Marcus like a physical blow, each sentence more devastating than the last. The colonel informed Marcus that following a thorough investigation into the security breach, it had been determined that there were significant procedural failures that had contributed to the incident. While his quick response was acknowledged, the review had identified that Marcus had failed to follow proper protocols in several key areas. The specific charges were shocking in their pettiness. Marcus was accused of failing to immediately radio for backup before approaching the suspicious individual. He was criticized for not maintaining proper distance while questioning the intruder. Most absurdly, he was faulted for causing a disturbance in a public area of the palace where VIP guests might have been present. Marcus listened in stunned silence, as his heroic actions were systematically reframed as security failures. The very decisiveness that had saved lives was now being characterized as reckless behavior that violated established protocols. His 23 years of exemplary service seemed to count for nothing in the face of this bureaucratic assassination of his character. The punishment was swift and merciless. Marcus was immediately stripped of his position as a sergeant and demoted to the rank of private. He was transferred away from his prestigious posting at Buckingham Palace to a remote guard station at Windsor Castle, effectively exiling him from the center of royal life. His security clearance was reduced, preventing him from accessing areas where he might encounter senior royals or important visitors. The demotion came with a significant reduction in pay and the loss of various benefits he had earned through years of dedicated service. More painfully, he was banned from participating in ceremonial duties, the very aspects of his job that had given him the greatest pride and satisfaction. Marcus tried to understand the reasoning behind the decision. He requested meetings with senior officials to explain his actions and defend his choices during the crisis. Each request was politely denied or indefinitely postponed. The palace machinery had made its decision, and there was no appetite for debate or discussion. The official explanation given to the media was carefully crafted to protect the palace's reputation while simultaneously destroying Marcus's career. Palace spokesmen acknowledged that a security incident had occurred and had been resolved through proper protocols. They emphasized that all personnel involved had been thoroughly reviewed and appropriate actions taken to ensure such incidents would not recur. The statement was a masterpiece of bureaucratic doublespeak. It managed to suggest that the security breach had been handled competently, while implying that disciplinary measures had been necessary. Readers unfamiliar with the true facts might reasonably conclude that the guard involved had somehow failed in his duties rather than prevented a potential catastrophe. Marcus's colleagues at Windsor Castle received him with a mixture of sympathy and wariness. Word of his demotion had spread quickly through the guard network. Though the true details of his heroic actions were known to few, some believed he must have done something seriously wrong to warrant such severe punishment. Others suspected there was more to the story, but were afraid to ask questions that might draw unwanted attention to themselves. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of his punishment. For over 2 decades, Marcus had been part of an elite brotherhood dedicated to protecting the royal family. Now he found himself an outsider, viewed with suspicion and treated as a cautionary tale about the consequences of stepping out of line. His new duties at Windsor were mundane and demoralizing. Instead of protecting royalty during state occasions, he found himself checking visitors' bags and manning gates where tourists took photographs. The red tunic that had once been a symbol of honor now felt like a mark of shame, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. Marcus's family struggled to understand what had happened. His wife Sarah had always been proud of his service to the crown. She had attended numerous palace events over the years, meeting other guards' families and sharing in the prestige that came with her husband's position. Now she found herself making excuses to friends and neighbors who asked about Marcus's sudden transfer. Their teenage daughter Emma was particularly affected by the situation. She had grown up boasting to classmates about her father's important job protecting the Queen and later King Charles. The shame of his demotion, though based on injustice, felt real and humiliating. She began avoiding discussions about her father's work and withdrew from social situations where the topic might arise. As weeks turned into months, Marcus began to realize that his situation was not temporary. There would be no review, no reconsideration, no eventual restoration of his rank and position. The palace had made its decision and would stand by it regardless of the human cost. His sacrifice in protecting the king had been repaid with betrayal and abandonment. The psychological toll was enormous. Marcus had dedicated his entire adult life to serving the crown with honor and distinction. His identity was inextricably linked to his role as a royal protector. The demotion didn't just affect his career, it shattered his sense of self and purpose. Sleep became elusive as Marcus replayed the events of that fateful morning over and over in his mind. He questioned every decision he had made, wondering if there was some alternative course of action that might have prevented the disaster that had befallen him. The knowledge that he had done the right thing provided little comfort in the face of such comprehensive punishment. What Marcus didn't know was that his story was far from over. While palace officials believed they had successfully buried the incident and its inconvenient hero, they had underestimated both the power of truth and the character of the man they had wronged. Forces were already in motion that would bring his case to the attention of someone with the power to set things right. 6 months had passed since Marcus Thompson's devastating demotion, and the injustice of his situation had begun to weigh heavily on those who knew the truth. Among them was Detective Inspector Catherine Walsh of the Metropolitan Police, who had led the investigation into the palace security breach. She had watched with growing disgust as the man who had prevented a potential assassination was systematically destroyed by the very institution he had protected. Detective Inspector Walsh had been investigating terrorism cases for over 15 years, and she recognized heroism when she saw it. Marcus's actions had been textbook perfect under the circumstances. His split-second decision-making and physical courage had saved lives, and the suggestion that he had somehow failed in his duty was not just wrong but deeply offensive to anyone who understood the realities of security. The detective had tried to intervene through official channels when she learned of Marcus's punishment. She submitted detailed reports emphasizing his crucial role in preventing the attack and recommending him for a commendation. Her recommendations were politely acknowledged and then quietly buried in bureaucratic files, where they would never see the light of day. Frustrated by the official response, Detective Inspector Walsh began quietly documenting the true facts of the case. She gathered witness statements from palace staff who had seen Marcus's heroic actions firsthand. She collected security footage that clearly showed the guards' quick thinking and professional response to the threat. Most importantly, she obtained the testimony of bomb disposal experts who confirmed that the device would have caused multiple casualties if detonated. Walsh knew that going public with this information would be career suicide. The Metropolitan Police worked closely with palace security, and challenging the official narrative would make her persona non grata with her superiors. However, her conscience would not allow her to stand by while a good man's life was destroyed for political convenience. The detective's opportunity came through an unexpected source. Her brother-in-law, James Mitchell, was an investigative journalist for the Times who specialized in stories about institutional failures and cover-ups. Over a family dinner, Walsh found herself sharing her frustration about the Marcus Thompson case, carefully avoiding specific details that might identify the individuals involved. Mitchell's journalistic instincts were immediately aroused. A story about a heroic guard being punished for preventing an attack on the monarchy had all the elements of a major scoop. More importantly, it represented exactly the kind of institutional injustice that drove him to pursue difficult stories that others might avoid. The journalist began his own careful investigation, using his contacts within the palace and security services to piece together the full story. What he discovered was even more disturbing than he had initially suspected. The decision to demote Marcus had been made not by military commanders but by palace administrators worried about public relations implications. Mitchell learned that palace officials had been concerned that celebrating Marcus's heroism would draw too much attention to the security failures that had allowed the incident to occur in the first place. They believed that quietly punishing the guard would demonstrate that appropriate action had been taken while avoiding uncomfortable questions about how a terrorist had gained access to the palace. The cover-up involved multiple levels of the palace hierarchy. Security footage had been classified, witness statements had been sealed, and staff members had been instructed not to discuss the incident with unauthorized personnel. Even Marcus himself had been required to sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement as part of his punishment, preventing him from publicly defending his actions. As Mitchell dug deeper, he discovered that Marcus's case was not entirely unique. There had been other instances over the years where palace staff had been scapegoated to protect the institution's reputation. Guards, servants, and even low-level administrators had found their careers destroyed when they became inconvenient reminders of institutional failures. The journalist faced a significant challenge in verifying his story without reliable on-the-record sources. Palace staff were terrified of speaking publicly, knowing that their careers and pensions depended on maintaining absolute loyalty to the institution. Even retired personnel were reluctant to risk their reputations by challenging the official narrative. Mitchell's breakthrough came when he managed to track down the bomb disposal expert who had examined the device found in the palace. The expert, now retired and no longer bound by official secrecy requirements, was willing to speak anonymously about the technical aspects of the case. His testimony confirmed that the device was sophisticated and deadly, and that Marcus's intervention had undoubtedly saved lives. Armed with this crucial evidence, Mitchell began approaching other sources who might be willing to provide background information. Slowly, a picture emerged of a systematic campaign to silence the truth about Marcus's heroism while protecting those whose negligence had created the security vulnerability. In the first place, the journalist also discovered that several members of the royal family had been kept in the dark about the true circumstances of Marcus's demotion. They had been told simply that disciplinary action had been necessary following a security review, without being informed about the guard's life-saving actions during the incident. This revelation was particularly significant because it suggested that the cover-up was being orchestrated by administrative staff rather than the royals themselves. The possibility that King Charles had been misled about the circumstances of his protector's punishment added another layer of complexity to the story. Mitchell knew that he needed to be extremely careful in how he approached the story. The palace's legal team was notoriously aggressive in protecting the institution's interests, and a poorly sourced article could result in devastating lawsuits that would destroy both his career and his newspaper's reputation. The journalist spent weeks fact-checking every detail, cross-referencing sources and building an unassailable foundation for his story. He consulted with legal experts to ensure that his reporting would survive any challenges from palace lawyers. Most importantly, he worked to protect the identities of sources who had risked their careers to provide information. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his lonely exile at Windsor Castle, unaware that forces were gathering to vindicate him. His daily routine had become a grinding repetition of minor duties that utilized none of his skills or experience. He had begun to wonder if he should simply resign from the service and try to rebuild his life elsewhere. The psychological toll on Marcus and his family continued to mount. His wife Sarah had been forced to take a second job to compensate for their reduced income. Their daughter Emma was struggling in school, distracted by the ongoing stress at home. The family that had once been proud of their connection to the royal family now felt betrayed and abandoned. Marcus had no idea that within days, his story would explode into the public consciousness in a way that would force the palace to confront the injustice they had perpetrated. The institutional machinery that had destroyed his career was about to face its greatest challenge, and the man they had tried to silence was about to find his voice restored in the most powerful way possible. The stage was set for a confrontation between truth and institutional self-interest, with Marcus Thompson's honor and future hanging in the balance. What happened next would test the monarchy's commitment to justice and reveal whether the values it claimed to represent extended to protecting those who risked everything to serve the crown. The morning of December 15th began like any other for Marcus Thompson. He performed his routine duties at Windsor Castle with the same quiet professionalism he had maintained throughout his months of exile, despite the bitter knowledge that his career had been destroyed by the very people he had protected. He had no idea that this day would change everything. At exactly 7:30 a.m., James Mitchell's explosive investigation was published in the Times under the headline, "Hero Guard Punished for Saving King's Life." The story laid bare the shocking details of Marcus's treatment, complete with unnamed but credible sources confirming his heroic actions and the subsequent cover-up that had destroyed his career. The article was meticulously researched and devastating in its implications. Mitchell had managed to piece together a comprehensive account of the incident, Marcus's life-saving intervention, and the cynical decision by palace administrators to scapegoat him to protect their own reputations. The story included technical details about the bomb that confirmed how close the king had come to assassination. Within hours, the story had been picked up by every major news outlet in Britain and was spreading rapidly across international media. Social media exploded with outrage as readers learned how a genuine hero had been betrayed by the institution. He had served with distinction for over 2 decades. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Justice for Marcus began trending on Twitter within hours of the story's publication. Citizens who had never heard of Marcus Thompson suddenly knew his name and were demanding answers from the palace about how such an injustice could have occurred. Palace officials were caught completely off guard by the media firestorm. Their carefully constructed narrative had been torn apart by thorough investigative journalism, and they found themselves unable to provide convincing explanations for their actions. Press secretaries struggled to respond to increasingly hostile questions from reporters who sensed blood in the water. The standard palace response of "We do not comment on personnel matters" rang hollow when faced with detailed reporting that exposed the human cost of their bureaucratic calculations. Journalists pressed for specific answers about why a hero had been punished while those responsible for the security failures that enabled the attack faced no consequences. Marcus first learned about the article when his commanding officer at Windsor called him into his office. The officer, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, showed him the newspaper on his computer screen. Marcus read the story with growing amazement, hardly believing that someone had finally told his side of the events. The relief was overwhelming. For months, Marcus had felt like he was living in an alternate reality, where his heroic actions had been reframed as failures. Now finally the truth was being told to the world. He wasn't going crazy. He hadn't misunderstood the situation. and his actions really had been heroic rather than misguided. The response from his colleagues at Windsor was mixed. Some approached him with apologies for doubting him, while others seemed uncomfortable being associated with someone who had become the center of such a major controversy. The palace hierarchy was notoriously unforgiving toward those who attracted unwanted attention, regardless of the circumstances. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, crisis meetings were being held to determine how to respond to the growing scandal. Senior administrators who had orchestrated Marcus's punishment were now finding themselves under intense scrutiny. The decision that had once seemed politically expedient now looked like a catastrophic error in judgment. Several palace staff members who had witnessed Marcus's heroic actions began speaking privately to journalists, emboldened by the Times story to share their own accounts of what had really happened. Their testimonies corroborated the newspapers' reporting and added new details about the aftermath that painted the palace's handling of the situation in an even worse light. The political implications began to emerge as members of Parliament started asking questions about how public funds were being used to employ administrators who would punish heroes to protect their own positions. Opposition politicians demanded investigations into palace governance and accountability, sensing an opportunity to embarrass the government. Security experts weighed in with professional assessments that universally praised Marcus's actions during the incident. Retired police officers, military personnel, and terrorism specialists spoke to media outlets about the split-second decisions required in such situations and the exceptional courage Marcus had displayed in confronting an armed terrorist. The contrast between expert opinion and the palace's treatment of Marcus became increasingly stark as more professionals spoke out. It became clear that anyone with actual security experience understood that Marcus had acted with textbook professionalism and extraordinary bravery. International media picked up the story, with foreign correspondents expressing amazement that the British monarchy would treat one of its protectors so shabbily. The story became a symbol of institutional arrogance and the way powerful organizations could destroy individuals who became inconvenient. By the afternoon, protests had begun forming outside Buckingham Palace. Citizens carried signs demanding justice for Marcus and calling for the resignation of those responsible for his mistreatment. The demonstrations were peaceful but determined, representing a rare public challenge to the monarchy's handling of internal affairs. The royal family's approval ratings, which had been recovering following various scandals, began to plummet as polling showed widespread public support for Marcus and condemnation of his treatment. The monarchy was facing its worst public relations crisis in years, all because of their mistreatment of one faithful servant. Inside the palace, finger-pointing began among the officials responsible for the decision to demote Marcus. Administrative staff who had once been confident in their handling of the situation now found themselves facing the possibility of becoming scapegoats, themselves as the institution sought to limit the damage. The legal team that had crafted Marcus's non-disclosure agreement discovered that their document was unlikely to withstand public scrutiny if challenged in court. The agreement had been designed to silence an inconvenient employee, not to protect genuinely sensitive national security information. As evening approached, pressure was mounting on the palace to provide a substantive response to the growing crisis. The standard strategies of delay and deflection were proving inadequate against the weight of evidence and the strength of public opinion supporting Marcus. King Charles himself was reportedly being briefed on the full details of the case for the first time. Palace sources suggested that the monarch was deeply concerned about the allegations and wanted to understand exactly what had transpired. The possibility that he had been kept in the dark about the true circumstances of Marcus's punishment added another layer of scandal to the unfolding crisis. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation between institutional power and public accountability. Marcus Thompson, the humble guard who had risked his life to protect his king, had become the focal point of a national conversation about justice, honor, and the responsibilities that come with privilege. What happened next would determine not only Marcus's future but also test the monarchy's ability to acknowledge its mistakes and make amends for a grievous injustice. The eyes of the nation were watching, and the pressure for immediate action was becoming impossible to ignore. By the second day of the media storm, The pressure on Buckingham Palace had reached a breaking point. Public outrage continued to build as more details emerged about Marcus Thompson's exemplary service record and the shabby treatment he had received. King Charles, who had been traveling on official duties when the story first broke, was now fully briefed on the situation and reportedly furious about how it had been handled. The king's anger was not just about the public relations disaster that was engulfing the monarchy. According to palace insiders, Charles was genuinely shocked to learn the full details of Marcus's heroic actions and the subsequent cover-up. He had been told only that disciplinary action had been necessary following a security review, never imagining that the guard in question had actually saved his life. What particularly enraged the king was the discovery that he had never been properly informed about the assassination attempt itself. Palace administrators, in their zeal to minimize the incident, had provided him with only the most sanitized version of events. They had robbed him of the opportunity to personally thank the man who had risked everything to protect him. The crisis deepened when leaked documents revealed the extent of the administrative conspiracy to bury Marcus's story. Internal emails showed officials discussing how to manage the narrative and minimize exposure around the incident. One particularly damaging message referred to Marcus as an inconvenient reminder of our failures, who needed to be quietly dealt with. These revelations transformed public anger into fury. Citizens who had initially been sympathetic to Marcus's plight now saw clear evidence of a deliberate campaign to destroy an innocent man's career for the convenience of faceless bureaucrats. The monarchy, which had spent decades rebuilding its reputation after various scandals, was facing a crisis of credibility that threatened its very foundation. Parliamentary questions were tabled, demanding a full investigation into palace governance and accountability. Opposition leaders called for heads to roll, while even government supporters expressed private dismay at the handling of the situation. The Prime Minister's office began distancing itself from the palace, making it clear that this was a royal household matter that they could not defend. Media coverage intensified as journalists competed to uncover new angles to the story. Television news programs featured security experts explaining exactly how Marcus's actions had prevented a catastrophe, while political commentators analyzed the implications for the monarchy's relationship with the public. The human interest angle proved particularly powerful as Marcus's family was finally able to speak about their ordeal. His wife Sarah gave an emotional interview describing how the demotion had devastated their lives and their faith in the institution they had served loyally for decades. Their daughter Emma spoke about the shame and confusion she had felt, not understanding why her heroic father was being treated like a criminal. International criticism began mounting as foreign media picked up the story. European newspapers expressed shock at how Britain's ancient monarchy could treat one of its servants so callously. American commentators drew unfavorable comparisons to their own military's treatment of heroes, suggesting that even republics showed more respect for those who risked their lives in service. The pressure became unbearable when several members of Parliament announced they would be calling for a formal inquiry into palace governance if the situation was not resolved immediately. The prospect of elected officials investigating the monarchy's internal affairs represented a constitutional crisis that could have far-reaching implications for the institution. King Charles made the decision that would change everything. After consulting with his most trusted advisors, he ordered an immediate and comprehensive review of Marcus's case. More importantly, he demanded to meet personally with the guard who had saved his life. Despite strong objections from palace administrators, who feared the meeting would only generate more negative publicity, the king's private secretary was dispatched to Windsor Castle with an extraordinary message. Marcus was to report to Buckingham Palace immediately for a personal audience with His Majesty. The summons came as a complete shock to Marcus, who had resigned himself to permanent exile from the center of royal life. As Marcus prepared for the journey to London, word of the impending meeting leaked to the media. Television crews and photographers gathered outside Buckingham Palace, sensing that something significant was about to happen. The speculation was intense about what the king might say or do to address the crisis. Inside the palace, frantic preparations were underway. For what promised to be one of the most important meetings in recent royal history, King Charles had made it clear that he wanted to hear Marcus's account of events directly, without any filtering by administrative staff. He also wanted to understand exactly how the subsequent cover-up had been orchestrated. The meeting was scheduled for late afternoon, giving Marcus time to travel from Windsor and compose himself for what would undoubtedly be an emotional encounter. He had spent months believing that his service to the crown had been forgotten and his sacrifice unrecognized. Now he was being summoned to meet the very man whose life he had saved. Meanwhile, the palace officials responsible for Marcus's mistreatment were facing their own reckoning. Several senior administrators had been suspended, pending a full investigation into their roles in the cover-up. The king had made it clear that accountability would be swift and decisive for those who had brought shame upon the monarchy. The irony was not lost on observers that the same officials who had tried to protect the palace's reputation had instead created the worst public relations disaster in years. Their short-sighted decision to sacrifice Marcus for political convenience had backfired spectacularly, exposing the institution to exactly the kind of scrutiny they had sought to avoid. As the afternoon wore on, tension built both inside and outside the palace. Marcus arrived in a palace car, his red tunic immaculate despite the circumstances. Photographers captured his arrival, noting the dignity and composure he maintained despite everything he had endured. Public opinion polls released that day showed overwhelming support for Marcus and harsh criticism of his treatment. Nearly 80% of respondents believed he had been treated unfairly, while approval ratings for the monarchy had dropped to their lowest levels in decades. The message was clear. The British people expected justice for their hero. The stage was now set for a meeting that would determine not only Marcus's future, but also test the character of the king he had protected. Would Charles prove himself worthy of the sacrifice Marcus had made? Could the monarchy demonstrate that it still possessed the honor and integrity it claimed to represent? As Marcus was escorted through the palace corridors toward his audience with the king, the eyes of the nation remained fixed on Buckingham Palace. Everyone understood that what happened in the next few hours would either restore faith in the monarchy or damage it perhaps irreparably. The humble guard who had prevented an assassination was about to discover whether his king possessed the courage to do what was right. The doors to the king's private study opened at precisely 4:30 p.m., and Marcus Thompson found himself face to face with the man whose life he had saved. King Charles stood behind his desk, his expression grave but unmistakably moved. The two men looked at each other across a room that suddenly felt charged with emotion and history. Without the usual formalities, King Charles walked around his desk and approached Marcus directly. The king's first words were simple but profound. "Sergeant Thompson, I owe you my life and I owe you an apology." The use of Marcus's proper rank, rather than his demoted status, was the first sign that justice was finally at hand. What followed was one of the most extraordinary conversations in modern royal history. King Charles asked Marcus to tell him in his own words exactly what had happened that morning 6 months ago. As Marcus recounted the events, the suspicious maintenance worker, the split-second decision to intervene, the tackle that prevented catastrophe, the king listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking for clarification about details. The king's anger was visible as Marcus described the aftermath, the investigation that had twisted his heroism into failure, the demotion that had destroyed his career, and the months of exile and shame that had followed. Charles made it clear that he had been deliberately kept in the dark about the true circumstances of the incident, and Marcus's crucial role in preventing it. When Marcus finished his account, King Charles was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something that shocked even his closest advisors. He formally apologized to Marcus for the injustice that had been done in his name. The king acknowledged that Marcus had not only saved his life, but had been betrayed by the very institution he had served with such distinction. The conversation lasted over an hour, far longer than the brief meeting that had originally been planned. King Charles wanted to understand not just what had happened during the incident, but how the subsequent cover-up had affected Marcus and his family. He was particularly moved when Marcus spoke about his daughter's shame and confusion about her father's treatment. As the meeting concluded, King Charles informed Marcus that immediate steps were being taken to correct the injustice. Not only would Marcus's rank be fully restored, but he would be promoted to the position of sergeant major in recognition of his exceptional service. The promotion came with a significant increase in pay and responsibility, effectively making Marcus one of the most senior guards in the royal protection detail. More importantly, the king announced that Marcus would be awarded the Royal Victorian Order, one of the highest honors the monarch can bestow for exceptional service to the crown. The medal would be presented in a formal ceremony, attended by Marcus's family and the media, ensuring that his heroism would be publicly recognized and celebrated. The king also revealed that a thorough investigation was already underway into the conduct of the officials who had orchestrated Marcus's punishment. Several senior administrators had been suspended, and criminal charges were being considered for those who had deliberately perverted the course of justice. The message was clear. There would be accountability for those who had betrayed the crown's values. As news of the meeting and its outcome spread, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds that had gathered to protest Marcus's treatment burst into cheers and applause. The British public, which had rallied behind the mistreated guard, celebrated what felt like a victory for justice over bureaucratic cynicism. The media response was equally positive, with commentators praising King Charles's decisive action to correct a grievous wrong. Editorial writers noted that the king's willingness to acknowledge mistakes and make amends demonstrated the kind of leadership the monarchy needed to maintain public trust and respect. For Marcus's family, the vindication was emotionally overwhelming. Sarah Thompson broke down in tears when she learned that her husband's honor had been restored, and his sacrifice finally recognized. Their daughter Emma felt pride returning, as she realized her father truly was the hero she had always believed him to be. The formal ceremony to present Marcus with the Royal Victorian Order took place 3 weeks later, in the ballroom of Buckingham Palace. King Charles personally pinned the medal to Marcus's uniform while cameras captured the moment for history. In his speech, the king praised Marcus's extraordinary courage and selfless devotion to duty, and acknowledged that the crown is forever in his debt. The ceremony was attended by Marcus's family, his fellow guards, and senior officials from across the security services. Many of those present were moved to tears as they witnessed justice finally being served after months of institutional failure and cover-up. The investigation into the officials responsible for Marcus's mistreatment concluded with several dismissals and criminal prosecutions. The head of palace administration was forced to resign in disgrace, while others faced charges ranging from misconduct in public office to perverting the course of justice. The king made it clear that such betrayals of trust would never be tolerated again. Marcus returned to his duties at Buckingham Palace with his rank and reputation not just restored, but enhanced. His fellow guards, many of whom had doubted the official story about his demotion, welcomed him back with genuine respect and admiration. He became something of a legend within the Royal Protection Service, the guard who had saved the king's life and survived the attempt to destroy him. The incident led to significant reforms in palace governance and accountability. New procedures were established to ensure that heroic actions would be properly recognized rather than covered up, and that no employee would ever again be scapegoated to protect institutional reputations. The monarchy emerged from the crisis with its credibility bruised but ultimately strengthened by its willingness to admit mistakes and correct them. For Marcus Thompson, the vindication was complete but bittersweet. He had suffered months of unjust punishment and public shame before truth finally prevailed. However, he bore no grudges against the institution he had served faithfully. His loyalty to the crown remained absolute, though he had learned that loyalty must flow both ways to be meaningful. The story of Marcus Thompson became a powerful reminder that heroism can emerge from the most ordinary circumstances, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, can ultimately triumph over institutional self-interest. His courage in that moment of crisis had saved a life, but his perseverance through the dark months that followed had saved something perhaps even more valuable: the honor and integrity of the monarchy itself. Years later, when young guards joined the Royal Protection Service, they would hear the story of Sergeant Major Marcus Thompson as part of their training. It served as both an inspiration and a warning. Inspiration about the nobility of service and sacrifice, and a warning about the importance of standing up for what is right, Even when institutional pressures pushed toward expedience and cover-up, Marcus Thompson had proven that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when called upon to serve something greater than themselves. More importantly, he had shown that truth and justice, though they might be buried temporarily by those in power, have a way of rising to the surface when brave individuals refuse to let them die.